quickly?
Yeah.
Yes. I like the unexpected shock.
Yeah, I just would like to answer in a very simple and humble way, let's say, but from the Swiss side. Just give a few reactions. Frankly, I would like to say something. You know, I think Switzerland is offering so far the most what any other countries has proposed. Because, okay, we have this abolition tax. I understand it's like an amnesty, that's clear. But if you compare with all the other amnesties I've seen so far, including the Italian one, not to mention Liechtenstein, it's by far the most interesting, I mean the most, from the state of residence point of view, amnesty that you can have. But my point is the future. And I really disagree with what was said, because in the future, you pay the tax. You pay the real rate of the tax. So, I mean, it's not indulgences. You just pay the tax. The point is that, of course, you remain anonymous. But you pay the tax. And you have to understand, and maybe this is a Swiss view, you know, all my bank accounts are declared, so I have no problem with that. But you should understand something, and maybe it's because we are strange in Switzerland, but the bank secrecy, it's on our DNA. I was born with the bank secrecy. Everybody in Switzerland, we like privacy. There's nothing more I can say. We just don't want the state to scrutinize everything that we do. And if you see what's going on in the future, not to mention Facebook and Google and all the rest, we might think twice in the future about this. And maybe in 10 years, you will have congresses about, well, we should go back to privacy because it has gone too far. So, as a compromise, Switzerland is proposing anonymous to remain anonymous from the tax administration on one side, but you pay the tax. And if the rate of tax will change in your country of residence, we will change the rate as well. So, I understand it's not perfect, but it's just a compromise. But I think you should at least say to Switzerland that we offer something which is enormous in comparison to what has been offered so far. And all the cost, the IT, the work, the analysis of the tax law, and the collection is going to be done by Switzerland. So many states will be very happy to have an outsourcing of the tax to Switzerland. That's just what I wanted to say.
There is one more shocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I can add something from the German perspective again. I think we would like to have all the information from the Switzerland, but they don't like to give us because it's DNA question. So that's the problem. And for some good reason, the borders limits the power of the state, of the sovereignty. And I think that's a good thing, because the states have to live together in peace. I think that's very important. So, and Germany has a bad experience with other behaviors over years, over decades, which you know already. So I think the only way is to negotiate. And then they have to negotiate a solution. It's not a perfect solution. But it is not like this, that the former situation was more tax equal. No, it was worse. It was worse. Because we had no possibility to get any information. I think that's much, much better to have later on a situation of a final withdrawal tax. In Germany, we have also an anonymous final withholding tax. So it is the same situation which we get. So I don't see this tax inequality. The other question is the past. But to get in the past an equal situation is impossible. It's impossible. So it's always a question of a compromise. And in the detail, I agree with some of the critics, the loopholes and the question we have talked about, but I think the endurance wrapper is not a loophole in our agreement between Germany and Switzerland, because it's named as an I think investment which is levied by the withholding tax. Yeah. So I don't think this is a real problem, but there are some loopholes remaining. I agree with you. So that's a problem in detail, and for this we can criticize our government. And I've heard in the pause an argument which makes me thinking. And an Italian participant asked me, what do you think about your government from an EU perspective? France did it from a legal perspective of the EU, but from a political perspective. On one side, Germany promotes a unified fiscal discipline. This was the question. And on the other side, Germany do something for its own in accordance to UK, where the UK is named for individual ways, not unified politicals in the EU, yes, not in the euro or something like that. And here you change your policy. This was the critics. Germany changing the policy. And perhaps this is something which our government has underestimated, how it looks like from the view of other countries who are outside from the idea of the fiscal discipline, which should be in the same way, and then should be the tax policy with Switzerland in a unified way in the EU. I've never thought about this in this sharpness, but perhaps this might be a political question that some other EU states, especially from the south, say, Germany is going in a single way with Switzerland. On the other hand, they want to have a budgetarian, unified fiscal discipline, even in the south. This is not a consequent policy. That might be a critic too. Okay, I'm not from the government, so this is something which they perhaps have to think about to justify, to argue the agreement much better than they have done it before. It has legs, but it is not the worst of the worst.
I'm just going to respond at the moment to Xavier's comments. Xavier and I, we're very good friends, and I hope this won't damage our friendship, and you're here to defend the indefensible. But realistically, let's look at this. Bank secrecy is in your DNA. It isn't in mine, and it isn't in ours of other countries. We inherently start from the assumption that taxpayers are honest and report all their income in their tax returns. If your DNA is infecting mine, I'm entitled to stop the infection growing. I have no difficulty if Switzerland wants to give bank secrecy to Swiss residents and Swiss nationals. I don't want to know about your bank account, but I do want my tax authorities to be able to see what my residents have in their bank accounts, whether they are here or in another country. And with respect, you're not giving the best deal that's on availability at the moment. Generally, we have moved in the last 10 years at an astonishing speed towards automatic exchange of information. We've been moving definitely in that direction, as Franz pointed out, within the EU, and you are trying, you're a bit like the Dutch little boy with his finger in the dike trying to stop the flood. And the danger is that if you're successful, you will stop that move in Europe and elsewhere. In passing in your presentation, you said, and I think I can quote this correctly, some people suggested the Rubik agreements. We know who those people were. They were the Swiss Bank Federation, concerned that they were losing a lot of their business. After all, they've had very good business in the past. They banked Nazi money during the Second World War. They banked money for victims of the Nazis and didn't necessarily give it back after the Second World War. There's a tainted history here behind this. The Swiss Bank Federation came up with this, and they must have been laughing. That little picture of Madame Schlumpf, I'm sorry, I still can't get her name, they're smiling after the agreement. is not surprising. She was taking back to Switzerland a promise of future wealth for the Swiss bankers. I'm sorry, I've got some former students, very good friends who are Swiss bankers, but the rest of Europe doesn't owe them a job for life and for the future. And that's essentially the background behind this agreement there. And I'm sorry, I came to this agreement, I hadn't actually particularly looked at it before this seminar, because it hasn't impacted on clients of mine yet. And I came to it with a relatively open mind, I'll have to say. It didn't take me very long to come to a conclusion that I cannot understand how the UK government can have been so mistaken and misled to sign this agreement there. And I'm going on a little bit, but I will posit an interesting scenario. Let us suppose that the European Commission, let's suppose the agreement come into force and some people disclose their accounts. Others arrange for the lump sum to be paid and for withholding tax to be withheld. And the European Commission takes the UK and Germany to the European Court on the grounds that they had no competence, and they win. And the agreement is held to be invalid, as I think there are strong feelings that may be the case. What about the people who've paid their money? Do they get it back anonymously? Does the Swiss government say, oh, excuse me, we transferred that money without giving it details? The answer has to be that those people must either give the information about who they are or accept that they've lost 22% of their capital and up to 48% of their income there. If that's the case, and I think that's a realistic scenario going forward, I imagine it's a realistic scenario, then if somebody who has been evading tax in Switzerland all these years is told that might happen, isn't that person either going to use a Liechtenstein insurance wrapper or a discretionary trust if they haven't got it already, or move the money out? What they're not going to do is to tell their bank to pay over 20, 25, 22% of the capital in the possibility that they may never ever see that money again, nor get the indulgence they hope they would buy from it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Two very short comments. I think the agreement is a very creative one, if I may say, and for two reasons. One for the past and one for the future. With respect to the past, we are faced with an amnesty, okay? But it's a very unusual amnesty, because normally the amnesty goes with disclosure. You know, people come to light. You know, they just disclose their assets. They pay their tax, and that's fine, okay? Here, this is very unusual because you've got the amnesty, but you don't come to light. So that's something which is certainly quite difficult to accept for tax authorities. The second comment goes to the future. I take Xavier's point that, you know, in theory this is all fine, because what the Swiss are going to do is levy the taxes that in any event the UK or the German would levy, and all the more they will just levy that tax at their own cost, which is even a better deal for the tax authorities. The problem is not this one. The problem is the fact that the German and the UK authorities are forgiving their right to tax audits, so their right to control that the tax has been correctly imposed. Now, of course, there is no reason to believe that the Swiss authorities will do a bad job. That's true. But as a matter of principle, it is very difficult to accept that German tax and UK tax are going to be imposed by a foreign a foreign authority which is not acting under the close control of the local one. And as everyone knows, there might be differences in the way those agreements are interpreted. You know, when a taxpayer files a tax return, he may be wrong, you know, and then there is a tax audit, and there may be a litigation as to whether or not the tax is due. There might be areas where there will be uncertainty whether this withholding tax is due or not, and the local authorities are just telling, you know, the Swiss, you will decide, and this is you who will, you know, make the analysis as to whether the tax basis is correctly computed and whether the tax is correctly levied. And this is, to me, this is the thing which is the most difficult to accept for countries, at least the French, the France.
Thanks, Gauthier. France, please.
Yes. First of all, I think I would like to make a comparison because we have been making comparison with viruses and DNAs and DNAs and so on. When I talk to my students, always on cases of evasion, tax avoidance and tax fraud, I always compare the taxpayer to a salmon, the fish. You know what salmons do. You know, they swim and then they go from a very low part in the river to a higher part of the river. And that's exactly what happens to taxpayers. That is, some salmons, after when they have the first barrier, you know, they give up, you know, and they don't go any higher. And then you have other salmons which are a little bit more sturdy and hardier, and they go up, and they second barrier and third barrier. And then you have salmons that end up really, they will try to get any hate. That's the same with taxpayers. When you in the law you have a barrier, then you catch some taxpayers who are not really very innovative or creative, and you know they pay up. And the second barrier, etc., etc. There will be taxpayers always when you try to combat fraud and tax evasion who would go to the moon not to pay taxes. Yeah, and I think we have to accept that. And so, when you make a tax system, you must accept that there are some taxpayers wanting to go to the moon, or to other places like Hong Kong and Macau and so on. And indeed, and they will not pay. They will not pay. And the question is whether we should build a tax system that catches all of them. I think it's a question of efficiency, and I would not do that. Second thing. The Swiss, of course, have now thrown a pond into the stone into the pond. Sorry, a stone into the pond, really, with their system. My problem with that is the following: probably Switzerland is a country which could more or less apply this system, and if we could close some loopholes, then probably it would work at least for some countries. But this is, of course, a system, particularly with respect to the EU. If some member states of the EU accept this system, then of course we have the policy conflict, as I told you, and the question is then, what kind of policy are we going to have? Because particularly in this respect, and this has also competitive issues, we should have a common policy. And my problem with the Swiss system is that the Swiss should think about a situation where all major countries in the world would apply the Swiss system. Or at least all EU member states would apply the Swiss system. Would that be possible or feasible? I doubt very much. I doubt very much. Because within the EU there is a clear distrust from one national tax administration to another. And that is one of the weak points of extending the Swiss system. And also there's another problem. I told you about the antinomy between the two policies. The EU has a document, a legal document, which is the Interest Savings Directive, where it says taxation in the state of residence. If we are going to change to, because that's of course what we will end up to, if we are going to change that and say we'll agree to taxation in the country of source, we have to change the interest savings directive. That's a unanimous voting, 28 countries. And you see, there is a political problem in the sense that the EU is not in a position to change that. Of course, we should have, and that was my final conclusion, that is, we should have a big debate in the EU about this and how to. But even if after this debate, we still have the problem that if we agree, we will have to agree with 28 member states. And I don't see this happen very soon.
Thanks, Franks. So we can try to have. Is there any question from the floors? Yes. Yes. So please give your name into the microphone.
Crosti Alberto, commercialista. Due domande. La prima è questa. Se corrisponde...
Sorry, the question to be in English.
Okay. Two questions. The first one concerns the Swiss bank. If it is true that some banks are ready to pay for their clients taxes, to refund their clients of the taxes they are going to pay within the context of the agreement between Switzerland, UK and Germany. And the second question concerns in case a German resident becomes a fiscal resident in Italy or in Spain, what happens with the agreement between Switzerland, UK and Germany? Thank you.
Thank you. We will collect the question and then there will be the reply by the speakers. Please give your name, Mr.
Thank you. Anonymous.
If you pay, you can.
I can say whatever I want. Actually, I have two questions. One for Xavier and the other one for Frans van Istendam. Xavier, about privacy. Has been a debate among negotiations whether to apply, in order to catch the beneficial owner, the money laundering legislation rather than, let's say, the international tax principles contained within the OECD model in order to catch the beneficial owner. Because you know that the two notions, the two definitions are very different, and the beneficial owner under the money laundering legislation is much broader than the beneficial owner under the tax law principles. Because it would be very interesting to understand how this is in equilibrium with the privacy principles. The question for France, it was very interesting to hear from Roman that probably Germany has underestimated from a political perspective this kind of action vis-à-vis the requests Germany is rightly doing with other member states. And I wonder whether EU also underestimates these kind of agreements. I make reference to the new directive on the exchange of information, which is a paradox, but is basically absolutely compliant with the Rubik agreements, because you cannot exchange information for taxes which are collected outside the European Union territory. So it seems to me quite a paradox that at the same time the European Union was in the process of approving the new directive on the exchange of information, Germany and UK at the same time were closing the deal with Switzerland. Is there a sort of a connection on this point? Thank you.
Good morning. Goffredo Caverni, Chartered Accountant in Pisa. I would like to ask Professor Oberson, in connection with this bank secrecy, from ethical point of view, do you think really that it is a genetical reason to avoid the authority to catch criminals? Because that is, for me, as Italian, a very important point. Also, in this time, unfortunately, I must speak about policy, because I think in Italy, the real problem is a criminal problem. And if you can avoid this criminal problem, you can avoid a lot of problems in Italy. And that is, for me, very important. Also, there is another example. The Spanish judge Garzón, that at the moment is in jail, probably, because he tried to find the criminals in the war of Spain. And I believe very hard in Europe, because I think that this Judge Garzón maybe can find a solution with the European Tribunal. And that is the reason because I think also Swiss must think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks. One more question there. Yes,
yeah, thank you. Alexander Rust, University of Luxembourg. I have a small question concerning the name Rubik. Is there a Mr. or Mr. Rubik, or is this the dice with the many colors? Huh? And one statement concerning EU tax policy. I believe that the Savings Directive has the aim to tax the individuals in accordance with the rules of the resident states. This is the ideal. And if the resident state applies domestically a final withholding tax, in my opinion, it should be in line with this final goal of the Savings Directive. If another country applies also a final withholding tax and collects this tax in the name of the resident state. So whenever the resident state has a final withholding tax, there shouldn't be any violation, or this shouldn't be contrary to the tax policy of the European Union. It's different if the resident state applies an assessment system and needs exchange of information. But there are many countries in the European Union who have a final withholding tax.
Thanks a lot. Now, a first round of replies.
Yeah. Okay, we just take. Maybe I will start with your question, which is a very broad question and a difficult one, actually. Just what I want to say is that the bank secrecy, to be very clear on that, it's protection of privacy, and it's not. It will not protect criminal, and it never did. So, on top of that, if you take the money laundering legislation in Switzerland, everybody agrees that it's one of the toughest in the world. So the point I want to make about this is that we agree in Switzerland to enter into even exchange of information or to try and find a solution. But what we are very worried, it's not my view, but I'm telling the view of Switzerland. I am in a difficult position here. You understand that, huh? And I'm not a banker, so I just try to tell you what I hear in Switzerland. The fear of Switzerland, and I think it's a real one, is that they say, okay, we have been very strong in private banking. Maybe part of it is thanks to bank secrecy, but I'm sure it's not only because of that. But what we don't want is that under the pretext of exchange of information, some other jurisdiction, and I'm talking here about major jurisdiction, will just try to take all the cake of private banking and apply different rules than the rules of Switzerland. Just a very concrete example. Ask the Mexican government how many names of Mexican customers in Florida they got so far. Nothing at all. And what I'm telling is all public. There have been some Congress debate about this. So if you want to force Switzerland to give names, you should at least do the same from a reciprocal standpoint. That would be a sort of courageous answer I could try to make. The second question would be from Giuseppe. This is absolutely a very good point. When I was discussing about this in Switzerland, the issue came actually. Why not to apply the money laundering rules? But what I understood is that it's already so complicated what is at stake that they prefer to try to apply international tax rule. And also, of course, there was a very strong influence of the savings directive. And from time to time, you can see that the concepts are similar. But again, I think the Swiss proposal is much broader than the savings directive. And there was some criticism about the loopholes, which do exist, it's true. But I think for trust, the proposal of Switzerland is much broader already than it is in the savings directive. And then maybe the last point, Mr. Rubik is not the husband of Mrs. Schlumpf, but it comes from the inventor of this famous cube. Okay, that's I can say at this stage.
I think the first question was the exit and the change of a German taxpayer into an Italian taxpayer. This is something which I have noted. So I think that's the case you are thinking about. Somebody moves from Germany as a resident to Italy and settled in Italy. I think that's it. So I think you have to distinguish between the past and the future. And at the past, I think the agreement is only fixed on a certain date. And if you're in this certain date a German taxpayer, then the rules of the past are applicable. And for the future, it depends, of course, if you are still a German taxpayer or not. So if you have moved to Italy, then you lose the status, and there's no withholding tax to be levied on it. I think that's the solution in a very short nutshell. The second question was the mismatch between the Administrative Cooperation Directive and the Rubik Agreement, so we know what the name of Rubik is. I think, yes, there is a little mismatch in the policy. I agree with this, but I think Alexander Rust has mentioned this. We in Germany have a mismatch in our internal policy because we are following even an anonymous withholding final tax in a domestic internal field. There's not a strong bank secrecy behind it, but we follow this policy. And then it is coherent to conclude an agreement with Switzerland which has the same attitude on it. So I don't see there a mismatch. And I think the EU is still a plural construction with very different income tax systems. Franz has mentioned it already. And it depends on how each internal domestic national tax system is being designed. And if it's designed like we have it, I see no real mismatch on this case. But in the long run, I think I see there a policy mismatch, which Germany normally we need even an information reporting in the sense of information returns from German bank secrecies. From German banks to German tax authorities. But there is no. Yeah? So I think that's the reason that it matches in the single case. But I see the problem from the EU perspective, and I think that perhaps our tax authority has underestimated this problem.
If I may, I'll come back, not really with an answer to the questions, but perhaps with another question, and one that's been puzzling me since this morning, and I think perhaps ought to be worrying those of you who are presently or will in the future be tax advisors if Italy were to have a similar agreement, and that concerns money laundering legislation. At the present moment, I am subject to money laundering legislation in the UK. If a client comes in and says to me, I have been evading tax, then unless the client says, and I want to make disclosure, full disclosure, and pay my tax, in which case I can then act without making a disclosure to the authorities. If the person says I'm not going to make a disclosure, I have to notify the UK authorities. I can't tell the client that I'm notifying, that would be tipping off the client, but I have to notify the authorities, which includes people working from the revenue there. Now let's suppose that a couple of years down the line, a client walks in and says, I've had money in Switzerland for 20 years, and I bought an indulgence. I paid the one-off sum. I am suffering the withholding tax there, and I have a promise that it's highly unlikely that I, the client, will be prosecuted. But what about me? I don't have that promise. I have a client who has just told me I am continuing to evade tax. I am continuing to sign tax returns, which I know are inaccurate. I am continuing to commit an offence in the UK. If I make a notification, I have to notify the name of the client. If I don't make a notification, I potentially commit an offence. So what am I going to do? I am going to get my own advice, and if that advice tells me I've got to make a notification, I'll make a notification. If the client realizes that, he won't come to me in the first place. So people who buy these indulgences, not only can't they leave the UK and Germany and come to live in Italy, but they can't come to advisors for the fear that the advisors would have to make an anti-money laundering disclosure. Now, unless the legislation is going to provide not only a promise of no prosecution for the client, but also a promise of no prosecution for the advisors, any advisor, excuse me, would be mad to tell a client, buy an indulgence which protects you but doesn't protect me.
Yeah. Well, several questions. The first question is about the what about the inconsistency in the German attitude, asking for budgetary discipline and then going its own way with respect to the taxation of investment income. First of all, I think this is a political question. It's certainly not a legal question. And I think there is even a bigger consistency in the behavior of the UK government, because the UK government in this area has been pushing hardest for disclosure and exchange of information. And in particular, countries like my country have been under pressure from the British to say, you are supporting the evaders. You should change your banking secrecy. And in Belgium we had a banking secrecy not so much because we wanted to support the evaders, but because we thought that withholding tax was much more efficient. Just like the Swiss, we thought that. We changed our thing, and now the UK is saying, well, maybe it's not all that serious. We are going to have a withholding tax. So I think that is an argument which, of course, can be said. But national governments, sovereign governments, are not always consistent. That's quite clear. Second question is about the fact that the directive on exchange of information only operates within the EU, and whether that's compatible with the EU-Swiss agreement. I think it is, and I think I have no problem with the fact that it is limited or restricted to EU member states, the exchange of information. And it's quite clear that if we had taken along this draft directive and tried to negotiate with the Swiss that type of exchange of information, I think the Swiss would have said no. I mean, that's quite clear. So I think, to me, it's not a surprise that you have the Swiss agreement saying Informationsaustausch excluded, right? That's quite clear. And therefore, I think it is within the EU. And of course, it means that with respect to exchange of information, we are restricted with respect to the information we will get from the Swiss authorities. And that's also quite clear from the two agreements with Germany and with UK, because those agreements provide that only under very specific circumstances you can have certain information from the Swiss tax authorities. So I don't see that as a real problem. And as long as Switzerland is staying with its position, there will be no way for the EU to have that type of cooperation. That's quite clear to me. The final thing was the remark by Alexander Rust, saying, well, the Swiss agreement, in fact, is not inconsistent with those member states as a policy. It's not inconsistent with those member states who have dual taxation like Germany. That is true. Indeed, it would be possible if you have dual taxation to apply the Swiss system, and of course it would take some change in the thinking and particularly in the method of collecting the tax, because the EU position has been that it's the resident state which collects the tax. That's not my problem, but my problem is that there are in the EU, and the main example is sitting next to me, there are in the EU states where it's quite clear that their national tax system is incompatible with the Swiss Rubik agreements. And France is not the only one. There are other states as well. And states may change their thinking, because Roman Zeyer was saying that there's debate going on in Germany whether the final withholding tax, whether that's really compatible with the constitution and whether they should not have a progressive tax. Now, if Germany changes into a progressive tax, I wish them good luck with their Swiss agreement. I mean, that's not going to work. And therefore, I think that is the problem. And I think the problem is so serious that we should have a large political debate within the EU whether we restrict the freedom of the member states to choose for the tax system which they like, which may be a progressive system, or whether we should say we will adapt the tax systems of the EU member states to a system in which we can apply the Rubik agreement. And again, I'm a pragmatist in the sense that, to me, if I can catch 90% of the revenue, fine with me, I will go for that. And I don't care that much about the niceties about who should pay a few percentages more or a few percentages less. Thank you.
There is last reply.
Yes, I just was trying to make a proposal to Philip issues about money laundering. I think, but this is just a personal view, maybe it could be fine, because under the agreement, the person who applies for the tax is deemed to be compliant. So in other words, my interpretation would be that as an advisor, you are with somebody who is deemed to be compliant. It's written somewhere in the agreement.
Xavier, come and visit me in prison. I'm not going to run that risk of not making a disclosure, because I've got a client who tells me that they are signing a tax return which they know is not a complete return, and they want me to continue to advise them even though they've told me that, because they have a get-out-of-jail card, but I don't have one.
Okay, but if I visit you, I will bring you some Swiss cheese.
Chocolate.
Just
So
sorry.
we
just-
are.
sorry.
Sorry.
Just one question, because we didn't talk about our Italian friends, but could someone tell us whether Italy is considering this agreement or entering into negotiation with Switzerland? Can somebody? Yes, but I'd like to have the,
Well, actually, our Prime Minister, who is, by the way, the president of this university, in a press conference 3 weeks ago, before this question, just said that the dossier is on the table of the government, and just after this morning session at Bocconi, he will take up a decision.
This declaration is in your own responsibility. The usual disclaimer. So let me conclude. Let me just do a final remarks. Here I am a sort of outsider. I'm an economist. And let me say that I had a lot of take-home value from this discussion, this panel, a lot of information, a lot of hints. So really, thank you very much to all the speaker, and let me hope that also all the participants have some take-home value of this very interesting panel. Have a good lunch. Thank you. Bye-bye.